All right, welcome to our second presentation on, well, it's really just a basic introduction to Norse mythology. Um, Ironically, there won't be much about ravens, wolves, or bears in this talk. Specifically, we're going to be looking at some attributes of the gods and talking about what makes a god in Norse mythology. So, this is the second in a series of three presentations. The first was on the mythic landscape, the cosmology of Norse mythology. This one is on the gods and the goddesses. We won't actually be talking any about specific goddesses. We'll be focusing on a couple gods, but more talking about the nature of gods and goddesses in Norse mythology. And then in the next presentation, the third one, we'll be talking about the cult of the gods in Norse culture and what that actually meant at the time. So when we talk about the gods, I want to talk about several things. I'd like to talk about the role of the gods in the society, how they were seen to act in society, the way they were conceived in terms of society. We'll be looking at the personification of gods. What is it that actually makes a specific god, and how that's represented in the literature at the time. And we'll also be looking at the notion of hierarchy in Norse mythology. Now, it's important to realize that what I'm not going to be talking about in terms of hierarchy is any kind of authority or who's at the top and who's at the bottom or anything like that. I'm going to be talking about the idea of hierarchy and how it seems to be expressed in Norse mythology. And it's worth pointing out here that all what I'm saying needs to be understood as uh, a lens through which you can view the literature. If you go and read the Poetic Edda, if you go and read the Prose Edda, if you read Volsunga Saga and any other sagas like this, these are ideas that you'll see playing out in this literature. So this isn't sort of meant to be a kind of spoken itemization of the mythology. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first of all, the role of the gods. This is what I want to talk about first. And what really makes a god in Norse mythology is that they are givers of goods. Now, if you take a look at some of the stories that you see in the mythology, particularly one of the stories that you get from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, you get the story of Utgarda Loki that's very famous. So a lot of people have retold this story. And in this story, you see Thor and several of his companions going out to Jotunheim, the domain of the giants. And they enter into several contests, which Utgarda Loki, he makes these contests seem like they're just sort of friendly competitions, but they're actually cleverly designed riddles intended to trick Thor and his companions into thinking that they're completely outmatched by the giants. And Thor winds up going home slightly shamefaced, but he meets with Utgarda Loki, and Utgarda Loki explains that really it was just intended to keep Thor from destroying them because the gods are ultimately so much more powerful. Now, what we see in this story is that the giants actually have the ability to deceive the gods, to act with them as if they are equals. So, what does that mean for the gods? How is if a giant can act uh, almost as an equal with a god? For example, Loki, his offspring is begotten with a giant. So if the giants are to be considered kind of on par with the gods, at least in terms of being more powerful than people, what is it that makes a god a god? And what makes a god is that they give us good stuff. You can pray to a god, and the god gives it to you. You can look to Oðinn for certain things. You can look to Thor for certain things. You can look to Freya for certain things, and they'll actually give it to you, as opposed to a giant who will just kind of eat you. So that's really what makes a god a god. They're also tutelary, and what that means is that specific gods will actually act as patrons for specific people. And we see this playing out in a number of the poems from the Poetic Edda. At one point, you actually find Oðinn mocking his wife and saying that, the guy that you're looking after, he's off having sex with giants in a cave, whereas the guy who's my protege, he's off being a king. Ha 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 ha. So what you have is, on the one hand, the gods act as patrons for individuals, giving them good stuff as best they can. Now, the gods also serve as a pattern for humanity. Now, they're not meant to be emulated. So, for example, um, it's not so much that you're supposed to act like Thor. You're not supposed to act like Oðinn. You're certainly not supposed to act like Loki. But you are given examples of how people should behave, how certain situations should play out, certain narratives should play out in society. If you, for example, the way the gods interact with each other give you examples of situations when a contract turns out for the best, and and what you should do when it doesn't turn out well. It gives the gods provide cautionary tales as well as tales which are meant to be emulated. So, in many ways, what you see playing out in the mythology are dramas that illustrate potentials for humanity. And in that way, those dramas then give patterns for how things could play out for people themselves, if that makes sense. And finally, the gods are cosmogonic. And what that means is that the gods generate reality, especially Oðinn, sort of god of secrets and dark, creepy things. He is intimately bound up with this notion of forming the world from the pieces of the dead giant Ymir. The gods, being cosmogonic, being formative themselves, then have specific attributes that play out in the natural world. For example, the oak tree is associated with Thor, and there's different ways that plays out, and that's kind of what I want to get into next. So these cosmogonic elements become then part of the ways in which the gods are personified in both the literature and in their cult. Now, the difference between literary personification and cultic personification needs to be detailed here. And what this difference is that in the stories you get Thor acting in certain ways. You can describe Oðinn as acting in certain ways, and you can almost make them human in the narratives, in the stories. Whereas in the cult, they're not necessarily bound by the same rules they're bound by in the narrative. We can't presume that the same rules apply in both. We'll put it that way. So what we're talking about here is we're looking at how the gods are personified and what attributes they carry with them in terms of narrative and material culture. Here's a little statuary that comes to us from the period, and it's often said to be Freyr. We don't really know for certain, but there are some things about this that do indicate a divine origin. For example, if you take a look, I know he looks a bit like a garden gnome, try and get past that. If you take a look at how this guy looks, he has this long beard, a gigantic mustache, he's got a pointy hat, and he has a certain fertile air about him, we shall say. The long beard and the hair, or the mustache, goes along with an association of hair with the pre-Christian gods and the pre-Christian cults. In many of the sagas, what you find are individuals that have this frightening or pre-Christian association, apostates, those who became Christian and then renounced them to go back to the pagan gods. They're often described as having long beards if they're male and long hair if they're female. In Brennun Njal saga, Burnt Njal saga, close to the end, there's a sequence associated with the Battle of Clontarf, and there are two brothers, both of whom converted to Christianity, but one of them goes back to worshiping the old gods, and he is described as having a very long beard and very long hair, and they're black. So whenever you come across these descriptions of long hair, it's almost always associated with pre-Christian stuff, we'll say. So the reason why this statuary is associated with Freyr is that it's got this very, very long beard, which is associated with pre-Christian stuff, and he has this, this erect phallus. And because Freyr was associated with fertility, these things seem to naturally suggest that this is a depiction of Freyr. If we think about Thor and changing track slightly, the the item which is most commonly associated with Thor is, of course, Mjolnir, the hammer, which is naturally lightning. And in a lot of Indo-European cultures, lightning is conceived as a blunt instrument. Specifically, Mjolnir, the name actually means grinder, is intended to be this sort of bludgeoning, grinding weapon. When you think about what a tree looks like after lightning strikes it, it's not necessarily just split apart. It looks like it's actually been splintered and crushed. And so the idea of lightning is crushing something makes a lot of sense. But if you take a look at this image, it doesn't actually look terribly like a practical hammer. It does, however, have a certain resemblance to an oak leaf. Now, I realize it's a bit of a stretch, but if you take a look at the oak leaf as opposed to the other leaves of trees, you can see that in this instance at least, and in some even more so, the hammer looks quite a bit like the oak leaf. So this is what we're talking about, personification. Now, personification goes beyond this, of course. If you look at the elements that are associated with specific deities, Oðinn in particular, you can start to get an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about personification. The word Oðinn is an Old Norse term meaning basically the crazy guy. Oðr is the same word as woad in Old English. And woad means basically that you're nuts, that you're off your chum, you're crazy. So Oðinn means it's the twisted, creepy guy, the scary guy, the insane guy. And if you think about what Odin's associated with, he's associated with mantic knowledge. He's associated with sacrifice, secret knowledge, and poetry. And this goes right along with ravens, because ravens, as a bird in the medieval period, in many cultures, were considered to have precognitive abilities. In other words, a raven always knew when a battle was about to happen. Now, for Oðinn, this is taken actually one step further, because Oðinn is said to have had two ravens with him, Hugin and Munin. And Hugin and Munin, which are thoughts and memory, were said to fly over the world and bring tidings back to him. So you have this god who's intimately associated with knowledge. He was also said to have only one eye, because he gave up his eye in order to gain otherworldly knowledge from a severed head mounted and preserved at the base of the Yggdrasil at Mim's Well. Likewise, Oðinn was said to have impaled himself on his own spear to the Yggdrasil tree, the sort of world tree that brings together all the different worlds, like we talked about last presentation. And so in this way, he gives up his eye for otherworldly knowledge. He nails himself to the world tree in order to gain knowledge of the runes, of writing. And so in this way, Oðinn is also associated with sacrifice. And of course, through sacrifice, he gains this otherworldly knowledge. Now, the interesting thing about the Yggdrasil is that Yggdrasil, as a word, means the drassel, which is something you ride, like a steed or a mount. And Ykr means someone who's really freaking scary. So Yggdrasil means the steed of the scary guy. And of course, the steed of the scary guy is Oðinn. Now, everyone knows Odin's horse is named Sleipnir, who has 8 legs. Why does Sleipnir have 8 legs? Well, it's commonly thought that the reason why Sleipnir has 8 legs is that he represents a burial procession. And if you have a dead body being carried by several people, you're going to have 4 people at least. And so if you have 4 people, you've got 8 legs. So there's this idea that Sleipnir actually is the 4 people who are carrying the dead body to the grave. So Oðinn is the guy who goes beyond boundaries, who passes beyond this world into the other world, who travels across borders and thereby gains otherworldly knowledge. So he's a pretty creepy guy, and he's associated with spirits, associated with ravens, and where you've got ravens, you're going to have wolves. So he's also associated with wolves. So he's a pretty creepy character. The interesting thing about Oðinn is that in Snorri's Prose Edda, what you find is that he gets given many of the attributes of the Christian God. He creates the world, he forms it, he guides it. all that otherworldly knowledge is being applied to the governing of worldly affairs. It's almost like Snorri Sturluson is trying to make this pre-Christian lore more palatable to the Christians of his day, because he wouldn't be writing it down if it weren't for Christianity. So he knows he's writing for Christians, and he's trying to make it a little bit less pagan and creepy and scary, less Oðinn-like. So from all of this, you should be able to see what I mean by personification, that Oðinn is given a persona, all these attributes that then sort of gather around his figure and make him knowable to humans. And of course, as a giver of goods, as a god, Oðinn grants this sort of mantic knowledge. He also grants victory in battle, not quite the same way that Thor does, but he grants victory in battle, usually through sacrifice. Okay, so let's move on to hierarchy. Now, what do I mean actually by hierarchy? What I mean by hierarchy is that what you have in Norse mythology is a kind of nesting of not authority, but of power. And what you have sort of at the center of it is this sort of triple god complex of Oðinn, Thor, and usually Freyr. Now, it seems from the sources that the earlier triple god complex is Oðinn, Thor, and Njörður. But Njörður in Snorri, at least, is Freyr's father. So Freyr and Njörður are very closely connected. And if you take a look at what these three gods actually stand for, Oðinn as the creepy guy associated with mantic knowledge, associated with success in battle, associated with basically all that you can gain from a heroic lifestyle. You know, you want the death in battle because it means that you're heroic. You want the wisdom and knowledge that it's going to give to you. Thor is the guy that you're going to ask for if you want a good, steady life on the farm with success amongst your best buds. Thor is the guy you want to go to the pub with. Odin's the guy you're going to whom you want with you in battle. Freyr is the guy who's going to guarantee that your animals all have lots and lots of offspring. So Freyr is a kind of almost a fertility god. So between the three of these, you've got success in battle, you've got success amongst your friends and in society with Thor, success of crops as well, and then you got Freyr, who's going to make sure that you are fertile, your offspring thrive, and all that kind of a business. Of course, this doesn't counterbalance the notion of the gods as being tutelary. So people would often venerate one over these other, but you have this triune complex of gods at the heart of everything. So these guys are at the center of it. But if you expand out from there, Oðinn and Thor are both Aesir. You have a division between the gods. You got the Aesir and the Vanir, and there was a combat between them. And between the two, the Aesir won. Now Freyr, whose father was Njörður, ultimately comes from the Vanir. So between the Aesir and the Vanir, two of the Aesir are major gods, and then one of the Vanir is one of the major gods. So you have this Aesir versus the Vanir. The Aesir are more important. They represent those gods that generate society, the bonds of society, whereas the Vanir seem to be more associated with sex, death, and magic. So the Vanir tend to be more representations of, or manifestations of, the actual mantic knowledge that Oðinn engages with. Mimir, for example, was one of the wisest of the Vanir, but he winds up being killed. And Oðinn then, through his knowledge, preserves the head of Mimir at the at the base of the Yggdrasil, sacrifices his eye to it so that then Oðinn can gain the knowledge from Mim's head. So you can see how this kind of plays out. Now the Aesir and the Vanir are both gods, but the Aesir are more important. Now, the Aesir and the Vanir are both gods, but then you've also got the giants, and the giants are able to interact with the gods. So they're actually working on par with each other, but the giants are lesser. The gods are ultimately more powerful than the giants, even though the giants are kind of on par. You should see what I'm trying to build up here. Between Oðinn, Thor, and Freyr, which are the preeminent gods of all the gods, Oðinn and Thor are the Aesir, and Freyr is a Vanir. And the Aesir and the Vanir represent a hierarchy. Aesir on top, Vanir just below. But the Aesir and the Vanir are both gods, and then just below them are the giants. So you have this nested hierarchy playing out. And then, of course, what you've got are the gods and the giants, and then you've got the elves and the dwarves. And the elves and the dwarves are some of the most mysterious figures from Norse mythology. You see, we have all these stories about the gods and the giants. We have sketchy, but we have evidence of the cult venerating the gods and the giants. We know that there was a cult of the elves. We don't even know if there was a cult of the dwarves. But we know that elves and dwarves were a major part of the mythology, much larger than it might otherwise seem. We know that, for example, there was a sacrifice devoted to the elves. The dwarves are sometimes referred to as the dark elves, the Svartalfar. So the elves and the dwarves had a very important place in this cosmology, but we don't know much about them. Now, some scholars have guessed that the reason why we don't know much about them is because they actually played a much larger role in the cult of pre-Christian Norse religion than the gods and the giants might have. Now, there was a sacrifice devoted to Thor, there was a sacrifice devoted to other specific gods, and there was a sacrifice devoted to elves. But because it's been so thoroughly eradicated by the later Christian culture, some scholars have suspected that elves and dwarves played a much more important role. But this all deals with the cult of the gods, and that's the subject for our next presentation.